Hello, dear students. Today's session we'll be talking about sources of corporate finance. It's the second chapter of your 12th curriculum. You can refer page number 14 of your textbooks for a better understanding. Finance. What is finance? As we all know, finance is also called as capital. Capital is something which is the basic need of a business. This need can be for starting the business, running the business, expanding, promoting, growing, and whatsoever. In short, for making money, the company needs money. This money the company can arrange from two basic categories or two basic means, either from owned capital or from borrowed capital. That means, for better understanding, we are categorizing the sources of corporate finance into two broad categories: owned capital and borrowed capital. When the company raises money with the help of owners or shareholders, we call it as owned capital. The shareholders here purchases the shares of the company and they supply the necessary capital. Another form of or another source of capital is borrowed capital. As the name suggests, borrowed means here the company borrows money from an investor. When I say borrow, that means it is a sort of a loan. And when it is a loan, it means there is a certain time restriction when the company has to return this money to the investors back. So, in short, owned capital is a type of an ownership capital, and borrowed capital is a type of a capital in which there is no ownership rights but there will be creditorship status over here. Owned capital, for a better understanding, can be further subcategorized into two subparts: external sources and internal sources. When the money is brought into the business from external ways, but this money will have ownership rights, we call this source as shares. When the same money is arranged internally within the company, is called as retained earnings. In the coming slides, we'll be talking about the external sources, that is shares first, and then we will be moving to internal source, that is retained earnings. Shares. As we all know, the total capital of the company is divided into small parts. Each part is called a share. General people or general public like you and me can purchase such shares of the company and be the owners of the company at a very, very small investment. Such people who invest in the company by purchasing shares are called as the shareholders of the company. The first question which we will be learning about here is, what are shares and what are the features of shares? Here we'll be talking about the general features of shares. First feature of share talks about meaning, smallest unit in the total capital of the company. The second feature talks about distinctive number. Now please understand this concept nicely. When the shares are in physical form, each share is given a specific serial number for identification by the company. This serial number, which is given to the shares, and each and every particular share is mentioned in the physical share certificate. A very common example that you get roll numbers in the college. These roll numbers are given to you by the college authorities for better identification and for managing the records properly. Similar manner, the company makes use of this distinctive number to keep record of the shares which they have issued what particular number of share or which particular number of share is issued to which individual helps in keeping the track record of this entire share. Let's understand this with a small example. For example, there are 3 shareholders of a company where A is the first shareholder, B the second shareholder, and C is the third shareholder. A, B and C individually holds 100 shares. A, being the first shareholder of the company, will start having shares from number 1 till number 100. Once A is allotted 100 shares, B comes into the picture where B will be the next second shareholder, and so he will be getting distinctive number shares from 101 to the next lot, that is 200. Similarly, Mr. C, being the third shareholder, will get the third lot of 100 shares starting from distinctive number 201 to 300. In short, if the company wants to know how many shares they have issued till date, they can. The next one is the evidence of title. The next one is evidence of title. If I tell someone that I am the owner of the shares of Reliance company, the question which I could be asked is, what proof you have? For such questions, my answer would be the share certificate. Yes, it is a document of title of ownership of shares which contains each and every detail about my ownership in the company. That means the number of shares, the distinctive number of shares, and so on. The next feature talks about value. Class, please note that each share has a value which is expressed in terms of money. Whenever we'll be talking about shares, 3 values generally comes into the picture. Face value, a value which is written on the share certificate or the face of the share, that is the share certificate. Issue value, value or the price at which the company sells its shares. Third is the market value or the value which is determined by demand and supply forces. So 3 values: face value, issue value, and market value. The next feature talks about ownership. Since shares are external source of owned capital, it has ownership rights. So all the investors or all the shareholders who invest in the company, they will be getting ownership rights in return. Coming to the next set of features, rights. A person who invests in the company by purchasing shares, what rights is he entitled to? First right, he gets the right to receive dividend. Second right, he has the right to inspect the statutory books of the company. He has the right to attend all the shareholders' meetings, and the most important right, he has the right to vote in such meetings and show his presence. This way, he can be a part of the decision maker. He can participate in the management decisions. He can interfere in the management decisions. So indeed, the most important right. Next feature talks about income. Well, it's human tendency. We all expect some return for the investment which we have made. Although shares are considered as ownership capital, so you can't expect to get lot of income, but whenever you will be getting income will be called as dividend. The next set of feature, till now we have learned about the features of shares. Now we'll be talking about the types of shares. Shares are broadly categorized into two broad parts, equity and preference. Equity shares, also known as ordinary shares, these are those shares which do not enjoy preference. They do not enjoy priority over preference shareholders. अब सवाल उठता है priority in which terms? So the priority in terms of dividend payment and priority in terms of repayment of capital at the time of winding up. What does that mean? कंपनी को जब भी डिविडेंड देना होगा तो कंपनी पहले प्रेफरेंस शेयर होल्डर्स का पेट भरेगी. अगर कंपनी के पास लिमिटेड रिसोर्सेज हैं तो कंपनी डिविडेंड में पहली प्रायोरिटी प्रेफरेंस शेयर होल्डर्स को देगी, और अगर बच जाता है तो इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स का पेट भरा जाएगा. इफ़ आई टॉक अबाउट रीपेमेंट, दैट मीन्स when the company is at a position of shutting down, winding up or closing, तब कंपनी सोचती है कि जिन लोगों से पैसा लिया है उनको वापस किया जाए, दैट मीन्स रीपेमेंट. इस मौके पर भी कंपनी पहले प्रेफरेंस शेयर होल्डर्स को ही पैसा देगी. अगर बच जाता है, दैट मीन्स कंपल्शन नहीं है, अगर बच जाता है तो कंपनी इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स को कुछ देने का सोचेगी. दैट मीन्स टू थिंग्स यू नीड टू अंडरस्टैंड. नंबर वन, देयर इज़ नो कमिटमेंट टू इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स to pay dividend. First commitment is given to preference shares. Number two, after paying everything to the creditors, to preference shareholders, if anything is left, then equity shareholders will get anything, otherwise no commitment for that also. The features of equity shares. Moving on to the first set of features, permanent capital. Equity shares से जो पैसा receive होता है, the amount which is received from equity shares is not refunded by the company during its lifetime. यानी कंपनी जब तक जिंदा है, कंपनी को इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स को पैसा देने की चिंता नहीं करनी है. जब कंपनी वाइंड अप होती है तब भी अगर कंपनी के पास में पैसा बचता है तो कंपनी को इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स को देने का सोचना है, अदरवाइज़ वहाँ भी कोई कमिटमेंट नहीं है. इसीलिए हमने लिखा है दैट इक्विटी शेयर्स आर लॉन्ग. द नेक्स्ट फीचर टॉक्स अबाउट फ्लक्चुएटिंग डिविडेंड, वेयर फ्लक्चुएटिंग मीन्स चेंजिंग. क्लास, प्लीज़ नोट दैट द डिविडेंड which is given to equity shares is directly connected to profits of the company. That means when there is more profit, the company will get more dividend. When there is less profit, the company will give less dividend. And when there is no profit, no dividend will be given to the equity shareholders. That means the dividend which is given to equity shareholders is uncertain and irregular. That means there is no guarantee, no commitment and no fixed return given to the equity shareholders. Talking about the rights of equity shares, as we have already talked, they have the right to vote in the meetings, they have the right to inspect the books of accounts, they have the right to share the profit, that means they have the right to get dividend, and most important right, they can definitely transfer their shares, but as per the provision laid down in articles of association. The next feature talks about no preferential right. Yes, equity shareholders को preference shares के मुकाबले कोई भी preference नहीं है, ना dividend payment में और ना ही वाइंडिंग अप में. दे आर द लास्ट टू बी पेड. टॉकिंग अबाउट कंट्रोलिंग पावर. क्लास, नोट द पावर टू वोट is the main power. जिसके पास वोटिंग पावर है, उसके पास कंट्रोलिंग पावर है. Equity shareholders has the power to vote. They can, with this power, they can attend all the meetings and they can participate in the management. The most important is that they can elect their representatives who are called as directors. These representatives work for the company on behalf of the shareholders. So, if the shareholders feel that these directors are not working for the benefit of the company, they have full power to remove and change these directors. That's a wonderful power. That's the reason they are called as the real masters and controllers. A famous saying goes, with power comes risk. Yes, equity shareholders also are attached to risk. What risk they have? They have the risk to absorb the losses of the company. They can't ask for money to the company, they can't ask for dividend to the company when the company is in bad terms, when the company is in a loss situation. They are the ones who have trusted the company, they have given the money to the company even when they knew that the dividend which they will be getting may be fluctuating or is not committed. Since they have taken this risk, they are absorbing the shock during losses, and still they are voting and participating in the management. Hence, they are called as the real shock absorbers, controllers, and masters of the company. Talking about the next set of features, residual claimants, where residual means bacha kucha. Equity shareholders, being the real owners of the company, they are the last one to get anything, or in fact they are the last one to claim anything. Whatever income the company gets, the company first does all the basic expenses, pays taxes, fills the stomach of preference shares through giving preferential dividend, and if anything is left, they do give it to the equity shareholders. That means equity shareholders are the last to claim on the earnings of the company. That's why we call them as residual claimants. Now, a very common question which generally students ask me is कि इक्विटी शेयर्स को ना तो डिविडेंड का प्रायोरिटी है, ना तो रीपेमेंट में कुछ कमिटमेंट है, तो क्या वो कंपनी के असेट्स पर चार्ज नहीं कर सकते या कंपनी के असेट्स पे हमला नहीं कर सकते फॉर टेकिंग आउट देयर मनी? सो द क्वेश्चन का आंसर है बिग नो. Why no? Because equity shares do not create any charge on the assets of the company, or in short, they are unsecured. At the time of purchasing only, they were told that they will be getting only and only ownership rights, the right to vote, and the right to receive dividend. In case the company fails to pay them the dividend or fails to pay them the amount at time of winding, they have no right to create any charge on the assets of the company, and they can't ask the money back from the company. Class, if you remember, in the classroom sessions, I have talked about two perks which the equity shareholders get. Perks means benefits. The first benefit with equity shareholder gets is bonus issue. Bonus means a gift. और जब कोई किसी को गिफ्ट देता है तो उसके पैसे नहीं लेता. यह गिफ्ट कौन किसको दे रहा है? तो यहाँ पर गिफ्ट कंपनी इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स को दे रही है. सिंस वो गिफ्ट है इसलिए वो फ्री ऑफ कॉस्ट है. गिफ्ट देने के बाद द नेक्स्ट perk which arises is right issue. Now understand, when a company needs more funds or more money for expansion, the company raises more shares, the company issues more share, यानी न्यू शेयर्स इशू होते हैं. जब कंपनी ये न्यू शेयर्स इशू करती है तो कंपनी अपने एग्जिस्टिंग इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स को पहला प्रायोरिटी देती है, पहला ऑप्शन देती है टू परचेज न्यूली ऑफर्ड शेयर्स. Please know that this is an option and not a compulsion. So अगर 100 एग्जिस्टिंग इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स को हम ये ऑफ़र करते हैं कि आप न्यू शेयर्स ख़रीदना चाहते हैं या नहीं, अगर वो शेयर्स ख़रीद लेते हैं और जो बैलेंस शेयर्स बच जाते हैं उनको हम पब्लिक के लिए ओपन कर सकते हैं. बोनस शेयर इज़ नॉट was a gift. Right share is not a gift, and here you give a right to purchase new shares, maybe at a price lesser than the price which will be available to the general public. So two perks which are given to equity shareholders is bonus and right issue. Talking about face value, equity shares की face value generally low होती है, can be in multiples of rupees 1 or 100. अगर मैं मार्केट वैल्यू की बात करूं तो इक्विटी शेयर्स की मार्केट वैल्यू सबसे ज़्यादा फ्लक्चुएट होती है एज़ कम्पेयर टू अदर सिक्योरिटीज़. वाई? क्योंकि मार्केट वैल्यू जनरली लिंक होती है डिमांड से. डिमांड जनरली लिंक होता है कंपनी के डिविडेंड से. तो अगर कंपनी डिविडेंड ज़्यादा देती है तो डिमांड बढ़ेगा, डिमांड बढ़ेगा तो उस प्रोडक्ट का प्राइस यानी मार्केट वैल्यू भी बढ़ेगा. बट अगर किसी रीज़न से कंपनी डिविडेंड कम दे पाती है सो मार्केट में बात फैलती है कि कंपनी ने डिविडेंड कम दिया, कंपनी का गुडविल कम होता है, कंपनी का डिमांड कम होता है और इस रीज़न से कंपनी का मार्केट वैल्यू भी कम हो सकता है. सो हियर वी एंड अप विद द फीचर्स ऑफ इक्विटी शेयर्स. Time to learn about preference shares. How do I define preference shares? They are those shares which have priority over equity shares in terms of dividend payment and in terms of repayment. Features of preference shares. The first feature talks about preference for dividend. Yes, they have preference over equity shares in terms of dividend payment. Second feature talks about preference for repayment. Yes, they do have preference over equity shares in respect to return of capital when the company is being winding up or liquidating. Fixed return. Preference shares get dividend at fixed rate of return. This rate of dividend, this dividend is predetermined or disclosed earlier itself to the shareholders at the time of issue, which is mentioned in the share certificate. Two things to note over here is that preference shareholders को जो dividend मिलता है वो fixed भी होता है और वो guaranteed भी होता है. Moving to the next set, that is nature of capital. Preference shares से जो पैसा मिलता है that is not a sort of a permanent capital. Why? Because they can be redeemed after certain period of time. Yes, प्रेफरेंस शेयर्स होल्डर्स को ये एक्स्ट्रा बेनिफिट दिया जा रहा है जिसमें अगर वो लाइफ टाइम में अपना पैसा कंपनी से वापस चाहते हैं तो उन्हें हक है कंपनी से अपना पैसा वापस मांगने का. यानी अगर कंपनी ने प्रेफरेंस शेयर से पैसा लिया है तो वो बेचिंत होकर ये नहीं सोच सकती कि जब तक कंपनी वाइंड अप नहीं होती तब तक प्रेफरेंस शेयर्स का पैसा वापस नहीं देना है. दैट मीन्स प्रेफरेंस शेयर्स को जहाँ दो फीचर्स पहले से थे, पहला फीचर था डिविडेंड पेमेंट, दूसरा फीचर था रीपेमेंट पे प्रायोरिटी, तो अब एक थर्ड फीचर ऐड हो गया है. वो फीचर क्या है कि दे आर रिडीम्ड और पेड इवन ड्यूरिंग द लाइफ टाइम ऑफ द company. Moving to the next feature, that is market value. Market value of preference shares does not fluctuate much because उनका rate of dividend ज़्यादा fluctuate नहीं होता है, डिमांड ज़्यादा ऊपर नीचे नहीं होता है और इसलिए मार्केट वैल्यू भी मोर और लेस सेम ही रहता है. वोटिंग राइट्स की मैं बात करूँ तो क्या प्रेफरेंस शेयर होल्डर्स को वोटिंग राइट्स है? तो आंसर है बिग नो, बट दे कैन वोट ऑन मैटर्स इफ़ इट्स ऑफ देयर इंटरेस्ट। यानी उनके साथ अगर नाइंसाफ़ी होती है तो वो बिल्कुल बोल सकते हैं, बट जनरल मैटर्स ऑफ द मैनेजमेंट, जनरल डिसीजंस ऑफ द कंपनी में दे कैन नॉट से एनीथिंग। द नेक्स्ट फीचर, रिस्क। Preference shares are at the less or the low risk. Why? Because उनको डिविडेंड भी गारंटीड है, उनको रीपेमेंट पे भी बाइंडिंग पे भी पैसा मिलेगा, और बीच में अगर वो पैसा चाहते हैं तो उनको वो भी मिलेगा। People who are generally cautious invest in preference shares. Talking about face value, the face value of preference shares is higher than equity shares. जहाँ equity shares की value हमने देखी है 1 रुपीज़ या 10 रुपीज़, वहाँ पर preference shares की value होती है 100 रुपीज़, क्योंकि जितने ज़्यादा features amount उतना ज़्यादा। If I talk about perks, तो जैसे इक्विटी शेयर्स को राइट और बोनस इशू के पर्क्स हैं, वैसे ही प्रेफरेंस शेयर होल्डर्स को ये दोनों पर्क्स नहीं मिलते हैं. दे आर नॉट एंटाइटल्ड टू any such perks. So once now we have learned about the features of equity and preference. So in your textbooks you can also see the difference between equity shares and preference shares. So the next 2 slides we'll talk about the difference between the two, where we'll be comparing the features one by one but at a little fast pace. Equity shares meaning and preference shares meaning, the definitions you can write. Rate of dividend in equity shares is fluctuating, whereas it is fixed in preference shares. Equity shareholders, they enjoy voting rights, however preference shareholders do not enjoy voting rights. If I talk about return of capital, equity capital cannot be returned during the lifetime of the company, whereas for preference shares, as we have talked, that a new feature has been added where they can ask their money back before the winding up, that is during the lifetime. Nature of capital, equity shares में जो invest करता है उसको रिस्क ही रिस्क है, वो खतरों का खिलाड़ी है, इसलिए उस कैपिटल को हम कहते हैं रिस्क कैपिटल. प्रेफरेंस शेयर कैपिटल इज़ हाउएवर एज कम्पेयर टू इक्विटी शेयर अ मोर सेफर कैपिटल टू इन्वेस्ट इन. नेचर ऑफ इन्वेस्टर्स, द वंस हु आर risk bearer investors, risk taking, खतरों के खिलाड़ी, they invest in equity shares. However, the investors who are cautious, they invest in preference shares. Face value of equity share is generally low, 1 या 10 rupees. Face value of preference shares is generally high, 100 or so. Right and bonus issue, सिर्फ equity shareholders entitled होते हैं, preference shareholders are not eligible for such perks. Capital appreciation means market value. Market value of equity shares, as हमने देखा, generally fluctuate भी होता है ज़्यादा और वो ज़्यादा increase होता है, जबकि market value of preference shares ज़्यादा fluctuate नहीं होता है और more or less same रहता है. If we talk about risk, equity shareholders में risk ज़्यादा है because fluctuation and dividend ज़्यादा है और गारंटी ऑफ कैपिटल नहीं है. प्रेफरेंस शेयर्स में रिस्क कम है, रिटर्न डिविडेंड फिक्स्ड है और वाइंडिंग अप में प्रेफरेंशियल आपको पैसा वापस मिलेगा. इसकी
With this, we end up for today's session. That's all for the day. Have a good day. Bye.